Eso porque es un gran invitado. Sabe mucho sobre lo que hemos hablado hoy día, sobre regeneración. Le preocupa desde hace mucho tiempo el futuro y el presente del planeta. Tiene muchos ideas, elementos, y por lo mismo quiero dejarlo en este escenario. ¿Tienen todo su traductor? Mira, seguimos con las manos arriba. Voy a seguir hablando de ti, porque de verdad Rick es un gran hombre que además ha estado junto a otras grandes hombres y grandes mujeres cambiando el planeta hace un buen rato, no desde recién. Estas personas que en el pasado eran como a veces eran percibidos como locos, ¿no? Locos de un tiempo donde esta conversación no era natural. Han construido una base sobre la cual muchos de nosotros, que estamos más recién llegados, nos podemos montar. Y ese trabajo silencioso en el pasado ha permitido que hoy tengamos una masa crítica mucho más grande, que necesitamos además engordar. Y por eso todos ustedes van a colaborar en ese propósito. Voy a dejar en este escenario a un reconocido ambientalista que ha escalado las montañas más altas del mundo. Fue VP de Patagonia, donde lideró iniciativas de sostenibilidad durante 15 años. Patagonia, aparte, es una empresa que ha tenido este propósito también en tiempos donde no era normal tenerlo, ¿no? Es miembro de Tompkins Conservation, productor de cine, autor de 7 libros, el último que trae en sus memorias, Life Lived Wild, algo que yo amaría hacer. En ellos comparte las lecciones de su vida al aire libre y aplicada al mundo empresarial, incluyendo justamente la más importante, que es que a largo plazo no se puede tener un negocio saludable sin un planeta saludable. Por eso estoy muy feliz de dejar en este escenario a Rick Ridgeway. Adelante.
Placer estar aquí con ustedes hoy día y agradecemos a Kristen y todos los socios de Walmart Chile estar acá a hacer mi presentación. Creo que era 10 o 15 años atrás, había una, ¿cómo se llama? Dibujo cómica en periódicos en Estados Unidos por el cómico Gary Larson. Seguro que alguien de ustedes están familiar con el nombre Gary Larson. Era un dibujo de una conferencia como este y una señora diciendo: ahora, señores y señoras, quiero presentar al hombre que subió a Everest y Kilimanjaro y el Matterhorn, y al lado puede ver el hombre tratando de escalar o subir las escalas, haciendo como así antes de cayendo atrás. Me voy a hacer mi presentación en inglés. Más fácil para mí, mucho mejor para ustedes. In 1980, I was invited to join a team of mountaineers to the People's Republic of China to attempt to climb a 25,000-foot mountain called Minyakonka. It was my kind of trip. A remote region nearly unknown to the outside world, with a strong team of close friends, including Yvonne Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia, who you see here making the first ascent of the Great Wall of China, or at least the first non-Mongolian ascent. Another close friend was Jonathan Wright. He was both my climbing partner and my business partner. I was a writer, and he was a photographer. And after the climb, we had a deal with National Geographic to journey from Tibet to Nepal, to do a story on the newly created Mount Everest National Park. And for Jonathan and me, it was a dream come true. Things were going okay until one day at 20,000 feet, 4 of us, including Yvonne and Jonathan, were caught in an avalanche, swept down the mountain over 1,000 vertical feet, and I was sure I was going to die. But then the snow slowed and stopped, and all of us were alive but injured, and none as badly as Jonathan. So I tried to keep him alive, but after a half hour he died in my arms. And we buried him under a mound of rocks, and we went home. And I went into a deep introspection, wondering if I should continue as a climber, and I didn't know if I could. And it took me 2 years to think it through, to think about what I learned, what I had taken from the high elevations and brought down to my life at sea level. And I thought how in my early 20s I had worked hard to learn how to be a high altitude mountaineer, and and that had led to an invitation to what back then was only the second American expedition ever to climb Mount Everest. And I thought how that led to an invitation to join a team to attempt K2, K2, the second highest mountain in the world. And I thought how deep I had to dig to keep putting one foot in front of the other, and how, unlike on Everest, there were no Sherpas to help us, how we had to stockpile each camp with supplies. And I remember the first storm when we had stayed in our high camp, hoping it was going to be short. But we were eating the food and burning the fuel that we had worked hard to carry up, and we had no choice but to go down all the way to base camp. And that storm lasted over a week, and when it cleared, we had to climb back up to our high point, and that took 3 or 4 days. And then we had just started pushing the route higher when the next storm hit. And again, we went all the way down to base camp, and there were 6 storms altogether. And after each one, we struggled to dig out our tents, and now looking up, we still had the head wall below the summit in front of us. And timbers were thin, and so was the food supply. And at this point, we had been on the climb for almost 2 months. And then 4 of us were selected at the very last hour to make an attempt at the top. We put in one more camp at 8,000 meters. And next day, the weather held, but the climbing was very difficult, including one section at 8,300 meters where we had to climb over rock covered in ice. And we had also decided to attempt the climb without oxygen, even though no one had ever done that before. And then finally, we reached the summit on what today is considered, of all the high altitude mountains in the world, the hardest to climb. And it was a good thing we didn't know that back then. But we did it. We were the first American team to climb K2, only the 3rd group in history ever to ascend the mountain, and the very first without oxygen. And I took that lesson of tenacity back home to sea level. And whenever I encountered an obstacle that I wasn't sure I could get over, I reminded myself that we had stayed above 5,500 meters for 68 days in a row. And that became a yardstick to measure those sea level challenges, and you know what, it worked. And there were other lessons, like how on a climb, like in business, you make a plan, but inevitably things go wrong, and you have to know how to adjust to be flexible. And maybe the most important lesson, and the hardest to learn, because it was so subtle, it was easy not to see it. And that was how the real goal isn't even the summit. It's the footsteps that it takes to get there. It's the way you get there, the how you get there that counts. And after that avalanche, I realized that I had changed even more than I thought. Sometimes I was waking up just amazed to be alive. And I remember one day walking from my car in front of the office and stopping to stand and feel the difference between the side of my face that was in sun and the side that was in shadow. And it was like being renewed with a new awareness of what it simply meant to be alive. And with that awareness, an understanding of how quickly any of us here today cannot be alive. And a few years later, I encountered a poem by the famous poet Mary Oliver, and her famous poem called Summer's Day, with the last line that summarized my challenge. Tell me, the poem commanded, tell me what you plan to do with your one wild and precious life. And that was the challenge that included this decision, whether I was going to go back to climbing. And then I married my wife, Jennifer, and of course that made it more difficult. We started our family right away. But mountaineering was what I did. And my time in nature had shaped who I was. And so I kept asking myself if the rewards were worth the risk. And then Jennifer said, Rick, maybe the larger risk in not going back is not staying true to who you are. And maybe more importantly, not meeting new people who might take you in new directions. And she was right. I returned to my life of adventure, and it was both avocation and vocation. I made my living as a writer and photographer and filmmaker, and I went on adventures to all 7 continents. And then a few years ago, I sat down to write my memoir called Life Lived Wild, and I added up all the years I had spent living in small tents in small and remote places, and it added up to over 5 years. And then Jennifer was right, because I began to meet new people who did send me in new directions. And the 2 most important were my climbing partners and my life's mentors, Yvonne Chouinard on the right and Doug Tompkins. So I started adventuring with Yvonne in the very early 1970s and with Doug in the early 1980s. And together we did dozens of climbs and expeditions, including a sea kayaking trip to here in Chile to the Magellanic Fjords to the west of Puerto Natales. And there we paddled in uninhabited fjords, and we stopped to climb a difficult peak in high winds and icy rain and snow. And back in our kayaks, we paddled for another week in water that was just above freezing. And one day, Yvonne flipped in a strong wind, and he had to fight as hard as he could to get back ashore. And during this trip, Yvonne had his 50th birthday, a big, big milestone for him and a big moment of reflection. And at the end of the trip, I remember how he smiled and turned to me and said, you know, Rick, this trip was just what I needed. So I've been to your country here in Chile perhaps 20 times over a period of 40 years. And on all those trips, nearly all of them included adventures with Doug and Yvonne, climbing mountains and fishing remote rivers and exploring the properties that Doug went on to purchase, and lands, as you all know, that would eventually be given back to Chile to create new national parks or expand existing ones. And on all these trips, Doug brought books that he was reading, and he would pass them to me. And around our campfires, our conversations would inevitably turn to the degradation of nature that we were witnessing with our own eyes. The forest being cut down, and as you know, the forest of lingua that are going to take generations to regrow, even if they ever do. We were witnessing the overgrazing of the grasslands that were turning them into deserts. And maybe most alarming, with our own eyes, we were witnessing the glaciers that we had climbed in our youths beginning to disappear. We were witnessing geologic time happening in human time. We were witnessing planetary changes with our own eyes. We were understanding it at a visceral level, and we felt morally obligated to do something about it, to use the tools that we had developed to do our parts to solve the twin crises of climate and extinction. And what were those tools? Well, in addition to being adventurers, all three of us were business people. At the time, I owned a small company with 20 employees that licensed outdoor and environmental photographs and film to advertising agencies. And back in the 60s, Doug had started a company making sleeping bags and packs and tents that he called the North Face. And a few years later, Yvonne started his own company that he called Patagonia, as many of you know, because of a climbing trip that he and Yvonne made here to Patagonia, the place. And when Doug got back from that trip, he sold the North Face, and he partnered with his first wife, Susie, who had a small company making women's dresses, and Doug rebranded it and called it Esprit. And by the 1980s, both Esprit and Patagonia were committed to environmental protection. And then in the early 2000s, Patagonia offered me a job overseeing the company's environmental and sustainability initiatives globally. But by then, my whole life I had always worked for myself. And even though Patagonia had this beautiful campus in California, I told my wife I wasn't sure if I could accept the job. And she said, "Rick, you always say that you like to try new things. So how about this thing called having a regular job?" And I ended up working at Patagonia for 15 years. And my responsibility, as I said, was overseeing all the environmental and sustainability initiatives. And our goal was to make our products with the least harm to the environment, to encourage our customers to do the same. And during my time at Patagonia, I also proposed to Walmart that we create a coalition of large apparel companies to work together to reduce impact on the environment. And we called the initiative David and Goliath. Well, that was my proposal, but Walmart said, "Uh-oh, there's one condition," and I thought, "What's that?" And they said that you, Patagonia, are Goliath, and we, Walmart, are David. So the effort turned into what today is known as Cascale. It's the world's largest trade organization for apparel, and it owns a software company called Worldly that makes the Higg Index that measures and manages environmental impact. And today there are almost 25,000 factories around the world using this Higg to reduce their impact. So I continue to work with Walmart, and every year I go on a rafting trip with Walmart executives. And we spend 2 days learning how to manage risk, and through that, we also discuss how to manage impact on the environment. And 2 of those trips have included Walmart's global CEO, Doug McMillan, that Kristen talked about this morning. You see Doug on the far right in the photograph. But the adventures that I really learned the most from were the ones I made with Yvonne and Doug. Here you see us on the summit of the most beautiful mountain in Patagonia National Park, Parque Nacional Patagónica, after we made the first ascent. And after that climb, Doug talked your government here in Chile into renaming the mountain Cerro Cristina. And I think you all got to agree that that's probably a pretty cool birthday present to give to your wife. Well, 9 years ago, Doug and Yvonne and I were on a trip again here in Chile with a few other friends to kayak the remote north shore of Lago General Carrera. And it was going to be a 5-day trip. And for the first 3 days, things went according to plan. But then one evening, the weather turned. And by morning, the wind was blowing very hard. And Doug and I shared a double kayak that also had a faulty rudder. The timon didn't work right. And as we struggled to reach the safety of a cove, a big wave hit us from the side that we didn't see coming, and the kayak capsized. The water was 5 degrees centigrade. And by the time our friends got us out, we were both unconscious. And I managed to recover, but Doug was too hypothermic, and by the time we got him to a hospital in Coyhaique, he was dead. We all rallied around Chris, and a few days later we buried Doug in this small cemetery in Parque Nacional Patagónica. And none of us knew for sure what Chris was going to do, but we vowed to support her as best we could. And we watched in awe as she changed out of her black dress and put on her work dress and rolled up her sleeves and got the job done. She created a strategic plan to transfer the parks to your government and to get it done in 5 years. And that was ambitious to the extreme. But she and her team got it done in 4 years. And we were there with Chris as she joined President Bachelet to sign the agreement to create those 5 new national parks and to expand 3 more. And I know many of you have probably seen the film that came out 2 years ago about Chris and Doug and some of the rest of us, and it's streaming now on Disney Plus. And if you haven't seen it, let's look at the trailer.
If you want to understand the entrepreneur, study the juvenile delinquent. Because they're saying, this sucks, I'm going to do it my own way.
You are born with a certain drive, and I essentially grew up with Yvonne. Doug and Yvonne were people who really and truly thought nothing was impossible.
There was a spirit that united this band of dirtbag climbers and surfers and business people. As Yvonne liked to say, you can't break the rules if you make the rules.
They were true hardcore adventurers, but then they went on to have these hugely successful entrepreneurial lives.
I was getting concerned about the environment. I felt like I was going to push my business to be more and more responsible.
They took what they did in business and were able to show the world what businesses can do to effect such massive change.
Well, 2 years ago, as some of you know, Yvonne and his family made an even more massive change in the company when they donated all of the voting shares of Patagonia to a trust whose board is now obligated to manage the company so that all of its profits, 100% of its profits, go to NGOs. And they created another foundation called the Hold Fast Collective that grants all that money to, thank you, that grants all that money to environmental groups that are doing the on-the-ground work to realize the larger mission of Patagonia to save our one and only home planet. But that definition doesn't explain why anybody should bother to save the whole planet. And the answer, I think, is at the highest level pretty simple. And I invite everybody here this morning to consider how all of our businesses depend on a healthy stream of resources that come from a healthy planet, and that without healthy air and healthy water, you can't have healthy societies. And if you don't have healthy societies, none of us are going to have healthy markets. It's this inextricable linkage that is summarized by the simple fact that there will be no business on a dead planet. That's why everybody here this morning needs to consider what we can do with our businesses to protect our one and only home planet. And not just our businesses, but our employees and the health of our families. For years that I was an executive at Patagonia, every summer we had a small group of university and college students who came to our company to work in the summer as interns. And one year they included a young woman who was an outdoor athlete, and she was only 20 years old, but she had been barely a year old when her father, Jonathan, had died in my arms in that avalanche in Tibet. Jonathan had named his daughter Asia after his favorite place in the world. And after we buried him in that remote grave, Yvonne and I did everything we could to stay in touch with Asia, to be fill-in fathers. And now she was an intern, and I knew that she would want to know more about how her father had died, because her mother had shut his memory out of their lives. And sure enough, at the end of her internship, she asked me if we could have a talk. And I didn't hold back. I told her how he held her father, trying to keep him alive. He didn't die right away. And then she thanked me, but she said that wasn't the only reason she wanted to talk to me. The other was that she had a favor. She wanted me to take her back to that mountain in Tibet where her father had died, to climb the flank and find her father's grave. And I said I needed to think about it, and I went to my wife, and she said, of course you're going, because Asia's not asking you to find her father. She's asking you to be her father. And I knew that if Jonathan had lived, he would have taken his daughter on some of his trips. And I knew those trips would have included Asia, the place that he had named her after him. And so that's what his daughter, Asia, and I did. We journeyed to the Everest region, where her father had many Sherpa friends who had been my friends, and now they became his daughter's friends. And we ventured to western Tibet, into mountains that had hardly been explored. We endured 60-mile-an-hour winds, and we climbed a 21,000-foot peak that was unclimbed and unnamed. And then in eastern Tibet, we approached the flank of Minyakanka, where her father had died. And it had been 20 years. And I didn't know if I could find his grave. But finally, on a high, barren buttress, we did find it. Only now it had been torn apart, probably by a snow leopard. So his daughter, Asia, and I gathered up his bones, and we reburied him, and we put prayer flags over his grave, and we began the long journey home. And during the trip that took 2 months, I shared with Asia the stories, the lessons from the stories that I knew her father would have shared with her. And there, some of the lessons that I've shared with all of you here this morning, about how you need to make a plan, but how you need to know that things are going to go wrong, and you got to be flexible. You got to know how to adjust. How in your life you need to learn that it's not about the summit, but it's about those footsteps to get to the summit. It's about how you get there. That in your work life as well as your home life, all of your lives need to have a purpose. And that purpose needs to be more than just about you. But it must be about how you can be more than just yourselves. I told her about my challenge deciding whether or not to returned to my life living in the wild parts of the world. And I realized that that's a challenge that is a process that's never going to end. And it's a challenge that all of you here today need to consider. That all of you, wherever you are on your life's journey, you have to pause and ask yourselves, what am I doing with my one wild and precious life?